The year 1518 was a time of crushing darkness for the people of Strasbourg. The air was thick with the stench of poverty, and the shadow of the Holy Roman Empire loomed large over the Rhine. But the horror that was about to unfold did not come from a famine or a foreign army. It emerged from the mind of a single woman. Her name was Frau Trophia. In the sweltering, stagnant heat of mid-July, the cobblestone streets were baking under a relentless sun. The town was a maze of timber-framed houses and narrow, filth-clogged alleyways. Suddenly, without warning or provocation, Frau Trophia stepped out from her threshold. She did not speak. She did not cry out. She simply began to move. To an observer, it might have looked like a jig, but there was no music. There was no flute, no drum, and no celebration. There was only the rhythmic, haunting thud of her leather shoes against the uneven stones. Hours passed. The sun reached its zenith and began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the square. Yet Frau Trophea continued. Her movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as if her limbs were being pulled by invisible, frantic puppet strings. Her skin turned a ghostly shade of gray, slicked with a layer of oily sweat that glistened in the twilight. Neighbors gathered in hushed circles, their whispers filled with a mixture of mockery and growing dread. They expected her to collapse from sheer exhaustion, but she did not. Even as the stars appeared in the black sky above the cathedral, she remained in the street, her body swaying in a silent, agonizing loop. By the second day, the spectacle had turned from a curiosity into a nightmare. Frau Trophea's face was no longer the face of a neighbor. It was a mask of pure, haunting exhaustion. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed on a point in the distance that no one else could see. There was no joy in her dance, only a look of profound internal terror, as if she were a passenger in her own body, unable to hit the brakes. Her husband's pleas fell on deaf ears. She didn't even seem to recognize his voice. She was trapped in a trance that defied every law of nature known to the medieval world. The heat wave intensified, but the woman's pace never slackened. By the third day, the physical toll became visible. Her shoes had worn through, and the raw flesh of her feet began to leave faint crimson smears on the cobblestones. Each step must have been like treading on broken glass, yet she continued to leap and twirl. The patient zero of Strasbourg had become a living corpse, fueled by a terrifying, invisible adrenaline. The local priests began to gather, clutching their crucifixes and muttering prayers against demonic possession. But the heavens remained silent. Then, the unthinkable happened. The madness proved to be contagious. By the end of the first week, the lone dancer was no longer alone. One by one, onlookers who had come to gape at her misery found their own feet beginning to twitch. A young blacksmith, a weary mother, a beggar from the church steps, they all stepped into the rhythm. Within 7 days, 34 others had joined Frau Trophia in her macabre marathon. The narrow street was now a sea of flailing limbs and ragged breathing. They were driven by an invisible force that refused to let them rest. Their movements were perfectly synchronized in their chaos, a choir of the damned dancing on the edge of the abyss. As their feet bled and their hearts strained to the point of bursting, the city of Strasbourg realized that this was not a simple sickness. This was an invasion of the mind, a viral madness that was just beginning to feast on the town's collective soul. As the second week dawned, the cobblestone alleyways of Strasbourg transformed into a stage for a grotesque tragedy. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a cold, paralyzing panic that gripped the city's heart. Frau Trophia, the woman who had ignited this fire, was now a hollow shell of a human being. Her dress was shredded, her hair matted with grime and salt, yet her legs continued to pump with a relentless, terrifying energy. She was no longer a person. She was the heartbeat of an epidemic. The spread of the dancing plague defied all medical logic of the 16th century. It wasn't like the Black Death, which moved through the breath or the bite of a flea. This was a visual contagion. Those who stood too long watching the rhythmic, agonizing swaying of the victims found themselves falling into the same trance. It was as if the rhythmic thud of feet against the earth created a frequency that shattered the human will. A sense of mass psychogenic illness began to take hold, where the collective trauma of the town, fueled by years of failed harvests and the constant threat of syphilis, finally snapped. The physical state of the 34 dancers was now beyond horrific. Because they refused to eat or drink, their bodies began to consume themselves. Their muscles, pushed far beyond the limits of human endurance, started to tear and seize. Yet even as they screamed in silent agony, their feet would not stop. The invisible force that Frau Trophea had first summoned seemed to have gained strength with every new recruit. The streets echoed with the sound of dragging heels and heavy, ragged gasps for air. The authorities, desperate and confused, sought the counsel of the city's most learned physicians. In a world before the understanding of neurology or psychology, these doctors turned to the only science they knew, the four humors. They concluded that the dancers were suffering from hot blood, a condition where the blood became overheated in the brain, causing a frenzy. Their solution, however, would go down as one of the most disastrous medical decisions in history. Instead of restraining the victims or placing them in quiet rooms, they decided the only way to cure the plague was for the victims to dance it out. To facilitate this, the city council cleared large open spaces. They didn't just allow the dancing, they encouraged it. They believed that if the victims danced day and night without interruption, the hot blood would eventually cool, and the frenzy would subside. It was a logic born of desperation and ignorance, and it turned the streets of Strasbourg into a literal slaughterhouse of exhaustion. Guild halls were opened, and grain markets were cleared to make room for the ever-growing crowd of the afflicted. By now, the number had surpassed 50, then 60. Men and women who had been upstanding citizens days before were now clawing at their own clothes. Their eyes rolled back into their heads, dancing until their joints popped and their tendons snapped. The city was no longer a place of commerce. It was a rhythmic asylum where the only currency was movement and the only end was collapse. The most chilling aspect was the lack of music. For the first few days, they danced in a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the shuffling of feet. But as the hot blood theory took over, the city hired professional pipers and drummers. They believed that a steady, upbeat tempo would help the dancers find a rhythm of recovery. Instead, the music acted like fuel on a wildfire. The drums provided a heartbeat for the madness, synchronizing the victims into a singular, pulsing organism of death. Frau Trophia was lost somewhere in the middle of this surging crowd, her feet now nothing more than raw, bloody stumps, yet she remained upright, a haunting monument to the power of a broken mind. By the peak of the second week, the atmosphere in Strasbourg had shifted from a medical crisis to a supernatural nightmare. The sun continued to beat down with a merciless intensity, turning the dancing plazas into furnaces of human misery. Frau Trophia had finally been taken away by the authorities, not to a hospital, but on a grueling pilgrimage to a shrine in the mountains. But her departure did nothing to quell the fire she had started. The patient zero was gone, but the viral rhythm she unleashed was now self-sustaining, feeding on the fear and spiritual exhaustion of a population that believed the world was ending. The city's experiment with active recovery reached its most horrific conclusion. Under the shadow of the great Strasbourg Cathedral, the professional musicians played their pipes and hammered their drums with a desperate, frantic energy. They were paid to keep the music going 24 hours a day, creating an auditory prison for the dancers. The victims, now numbering nearly 100, were trapped in a feedback loop. Every beat of the drum forced their tired muscles to twitch. Every note of the pipe drove their spirits deeper into the trance. It was no longer a dance. It was a mass execution, choreographed by the city's own leaders. Death began to claim the dancers with a chilling regularity. The first to fall were the elderly and those whose hearts could not withstand the 100-degree heat and the 20-hour-a-day physical exertion. Witnesses recorded that at its height, the plague was killing 15 people every single day. They didn't die peacefully. They died mid-leap. Their hearts would simply stop, or a blood vessel in their brain would burst, and they would drop like stones to the cobblestones, their legs often still twitching in a rhythmic ghost dance, even as the life left their eyes. The psychological toll on the onlookers was just as devastating. Imagine a child watching their mother dance until her bones protruded through her skin, or a husband watching his wife lose her mind in a silent, sweaty frenzy. The collective trauma created a mirror effect. The more people died, the more the survivors panicked, and the more they panicked, the more their brains sought an escape, which, ironically, manifested in joining the dance. It was a perfect storm of social collapse, where the very act of trying to survive drove the citizens towards self-destruction. As the hot blood theory failed and the piles of corpses grew too large to ignore, the city council finally realized their error. They realized that the music wasn't a cure, it was an invitation. In a sudden, sharp reversal, they banned all public music and dancing. They shuttered the taverns and silenced the drums. But the silence that followed was even more haunting. In the quiet of the Strasbourg night, you could still hear the thump, thump, thump of the remaining dancers, moving in the dark, their feet echoing against the cold stone walls of the alleyways. Frau Tropheia's legacy had become a permanent scar on the history of Europe. She was the spark in a tinderbox of medieval stress, proving that the human mind, when pushed to its absolute limit by hunger and fear, can override the body's survival instincts entirely. The patient zero has shown the world that the most dangerous contagion isn't always a bacterium or a virus. Sometimes it is a rhythm, A thought, or a collective break from reality, that once started, cannot be stopped until the heart itself gives out. The streets of Strasbourg eventually fell still, but the mystery of that first week, how one woman's silent dance turned into a massacre, remains one of the most terrifying chapters in the story of human behavior. The dance of 1518 was over, but the question remained: what other rhythms are lying dormant in our minds, waiting for the right moment of stress to tear us apart?
By the time the calendar turned to the sweltering days of August 1518, the localized anomaly of Frau Trophia had mutated into a full-scale, citywide apocalypse. The patient Zero had been forcibly removed, but she had left behind a psychic contagion that was now tearing through the population of Strasbourg with the devastating speed of a forest fire in a drought. What began as a single woman's solitary trance in a narrow alleyway had evolved into a terrifying collective possession. The number of dancers had swelled from a handful of curious onlookers to a staggering crowd of over 400 victims, creating a spectacle of human suffering that defied every boundary of social class, age, and physical capability. The viral outbreak of madness was no longer confined to the shadows. It spilled out of the cramped residential quarters and flooded into the grand plazas, the bustling markets, and even the hallowed ground surrounding the great Strasbourg Cathedral. This was a macabre ritual that claimed its victims with a chilling lack of prejudice. In the middle of the surging, sweating crowds, one could see noblemen in their fine, embroidered silks, twitching and jerking alongside beggars dressed in filthy rags. Wealth provided no immunity. Status offered no shield. Even children, whose small and fragile frames were never meant for such extreme physical exertion, were caught in the same rhythmic trap as hardened laborers and veteran soldiers. It was a cruel, democratic leveling of society, a death sentence that turned the entire city into a stage for a non-stop marathon of human endurance. The atmosphere in Strasbourg during that cursed August was suffocating, both physically and spiritually. A brutal heatwave had settled over the Rhine Valley, showing no signs of breaking. The air was thick and stagnant, filled with a discordant and haunting symphony of heavy, ragged breathing. The pungent smell of rotting flesh from the dancers' feet, and the endless, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of leather and bone hitting the sun-baked stones. Commerce, the very lifeblood of the city, had ground to a complete and total halt. The blacksmith's hammers, once a symbol of the city's industry, were silent. The bakers' ovens, which fed the hungry, had grown cold, as the workers were either dancing or too terrified to step outside. The streets were no longer arteries of trade or corridors of conversation. They had been occupied by a sea of moving bodies, hundreds of people trapped in a biological and psychological breakdown that was happening in real time before the disbelieving eyes of the world. The city's authorities, the powerful council of XXX, who governed Strasbourg with a firm hand, were utterly baffled and paralyzed by fear. In their long and storied history of managing devastating floods, crushing famines, and violent political riots, they had never encountered an enemy quite like this. You couldn't see this enemy. You couldn't arrest it in the middle of the night, and you certainly couldn't negotiate terms of surrender with it. This wasn't a political rebellion sparked by a charismatic leader, nor was it a religious cult performing a forbidden or heretical rite in the woods. It was something far more primal, far more terrifying. It was as if the very hardware of the human brain had been corrupted by a lethal glitch in the cosmic order. From their high, arched windows in the town hall, the council members watched in stunned silence as their citizens danced themselves toward the grave. The faces of the dancers were not twisted in joy or religious ecstasy, but in a look of profound, localized horror, their eyes wide and pleading, even as their legs refused to stop their frantic, murderous pace. This was not a choice. It was a biological hijack. The viral nature of the madness suggested that the sight of the dancing itself acted as the primary vector for transmission. The more people gathered to watch the horror, the more victims the plague claimed. It was a psychological feedback loop of the highest order. The collective trauma of the town, years of failed harvests, the terrifying rise of the great pox, syphilis, and a deep-seated fear of supernatural punishment had created a tinderbox. Frau Trophia had simply been the spark. Now, the fire was consuming everyone in its path, turning a prosperous medieval center into a rhythmic asylum of despair. The marathon had begun, and as the death toll started to rise, the city realized that there was no finish line in sight. Only the cold embrace of the cobblestones for those whose hearts finally gave out. As the second week of August reached its peak, the physical reality of the dancing plague shifted from the bizarre to the truly monstrous. The biological toll on the 400 victims was now so severe that the streets of Strasbourg resembled a battlefield more than a city square. Because the dancers were trapped in a state of total dissociation, they had ceased to perform the most basic functions of human survival. They did not eat, they did not drink, they did not sleep. Their bodies, forced into a state of permanent fight or flight, began to literally consume themselves from the inside out. This was a marathon of endurance that no human athlete could survive. Yet these ordinary citizens, undernourished and exhausted, were being driven by an invisible chemical fire that overrode every instinct of self-preservation. The medical observers of the